Good evening. Thank you for coming. I'm Martin Anthony. I'm the head of the Maths department here at the London School of Economics. It's my real pleasure to welcome you to this talk this evening, and I'm very delighted at the turnout. Tonight's talk is entitled Weapons of Math Destruction: How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy. This event is hosted by the Mathematics Department in conjunction with SEDS, Social Economic Data Sciences, a new research unit at the LSE. I want to thank the LSE Public Lecture Programme's team for setting this up and publicising it. I want particularly to thank my colleague Rebecca Lum from the Mathematics Department for all the work she's done. Today's speaker is Cathy O'Neill. She will speak for around 50 minutes or so, and there will then be plenty of time for questions. After the talk, she'll be delighted to meet you individually and sign copies of her book, which is available for purchase just outside the lecture theatre. Dr. O'Neill is a data scientist and author of Weapons of Math Destruction. She blogs extensively at mathbabe.org. Cathy earned a PhD in mathematics from Harvard and taught at Barnard College before moving to the private sector, where she worked for a hedge fund, D.E. Shaw. She then worked as a data science at various startups, building models that predict people's purchases and clicks. She's a contributor to Bloomberg View. In her thought-provoking book, Weapons of Math Destruction, Cathy addresses important questions about the use of algorithms in determining so many aspects of our lives. She argues that the sense of objectivity and fairness such approaches have is often illusory, and worse, damaging and discriminatory. We need, she argues, to challenge and to ask hard questions about the use of algorithmic, mechanistic approaches in social and economic decision-making. So please welcome Cathy O'Neill.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just getting ready to pace. Here we go. So yes, I would like to talk to you guys about weapons of math destruction, which are a type of algorithm that I find very alarming. This might be the example you thought you were going to come to see. You had to wait till now. This is really the only one that's like online. Micro-targeting is what's happening on the internet. The internet is an enormous micro-targeting machine. Everything you do on the internet is observed through pixels. I know about this because I used to do it. So you go on Expedia, and there's a bunch of what are called pixels. You should think of them as little tiny video cameras looking out at you from the screen. That's why they're called pixels. And they track you. So everything you do on Expedia is tracked. That's a pretty benign example. More generally, the consumer behavior you have is linked to your voting records, and you are profiled as a potential voter. This all started in Obama's 2012 campaign, and I might add that having met a lot of people who've done this, it is really frustrating to me how they assumed that people from Google helped them, that they assumed that because the left was the first people to do the first movers in the system, that it was actually a good idea. Like the left would have an advantage, so therefore it was okay. But I'm like, this is a technology that is not going anywhere in a good place. This is anti-democratic. Why is it anti-democratic? Because, and by the way, they have scores on you for everything. They decide how persuadable you are on every topic. They say how much you agree with a candidate on every possible topic. And they track you. So here's an example. The way I was looking at it is, if Rand Paul, a politician, a libertarian politician, who was running for Republican president last cycle, if they looked at me, they'd realize that I agree with Rand Paul in one way. He wanted to break up the big banks. So do I. So they could appeal to me. They can decide what to tell me about the candidate. Asymmetry. They know more about me than I know about them. And if I went to their website, if I clicked on one of their ads, hey Cathy, on Facebook, hey Cathy, Rand Paul wants to break up the big banks, don't you? I click on it. They bring me to a website that is made for me. They show me what they want me to see. That's what I mean by anti-democratic. It's asymmetry. Back when we had, this is a mythical past, which I'm going to talk about, but open debates between politicians where we knew what they stood for. We can compare them side by side. We had much more information about what the candidates, what I agreed with versus disagreed with. Nowadays, we're only ever going to see things we agree with when it's targeted at us. A lot of those Obama analytics guys went on to work for Caesar's Palace, which is a gambling house in Las Vegas. And they found in exactly the same way, the same techniques, high value customers. People who are very likely to be, say, addicted to gambling. Cambridge Analytica is a more recent incarnation, which is not working for the left. They're using the psychometric profiles I mentioned, which are based on the 5-factor model that Kyle was being measured through. Also, I have a couple more examples of the same kind of thing. Everything on the internet and our lives now is about this, about are we a high value customer? Do you remember that controversy where the United customer was dragged off the flight? He wasn't chosen randomly. He was the lowest value customer on the flight. That's how they chose him. Queuing algorithms. This is one of my favorite examples because even though it's not that pernicious, it's very annoying. So you call up customer service, right? They use your phone number to connect you to a profile, and they decide whether you're a high value or low value customer. And if you're a low value customer, you will wait on hold forever. If you're a high value customer, you'll be spoken to more quickly. That's a great example of something where you don't know you're being scored. How could you ever prove you were being scored? I'm going to give you a little story about how I decided to write the book. So I was working at this company deciding which Expedia customers to show offers to and which to not show offers to. Simple as that. I thought of it as relatively benign, especially compared to what I'd been doing in finance. Until one day a venture capitalist came to talk to us at the company. He was thinking of investing in our company, and we all sort of were gathered around. He was going to tell us his words of wisdom. And venture capitalists should be seen as the architects of the modern internet. They're the ones who decide which things should be built. They fund those projects. So he was telling us about his vision of the future of the internet, and his vision was this, about tailored advertising. He said, I can't wait for the moment when I see only ads for Aruba and jet skis, and I never again have to see another University of Phoenix ad, because those aren't for people like me. Now, everyone around me laughed, but I actually didn't know what University of Phoenix was. So I'd never seen that ad. University of Phoenix is a for-profit college. And for-profit colleges are scavengers on what's called the federal aid system in the States. So they find people that have two characteristics, and the internet is the perfect mechanism to find these people. People who are poor and thus eligible for federal aid, and people who don't know the difference between a for-profit college and a private college. These are typically second-generation immigrants, neither of whose parents went to college. They know that to be in middle class, to be a real citizen, you need to go to college. So they're doing what they are supposed to. These for-profit colleges find them and call them relentlessly, promising them that their biggest problem in their life will go away once they've signed up for these online classes. The recruiting manuals for the for-profit recruiters are like, find their point of pain and promise that that pain will go away once they've signed up for online classes. Then as soon as they agree, they sign the dotted line, they are loaded up with student debt, which they never see. That money goes straight to the for-profit colleges, and then they get into these online courses. I should say that the graduation rate is very, very low, and even when they graduate, the diplomas are not worth more than a high school graduation diploma. So it's a huge lie, it's a huge money-making industry, and it was using exactly the technology that I was building. And so yet again, I felt like I was a collaborator. Obviously, the same techniques are used for political donations, as I said, for gamblers, and on the other side of the spectrum, for luxury buyers. This, of course, is what is touted as the goal of tailored advertising. It's a service. You're connected to what you want. You're welcome. I remember, I'm one of those people. I knit. I'm really addicted to very good yarn. So I see that beautiful yarn and I can't help it. I gotta buy some yarn. But that same mechanism is preying upon people. I should have mentioned payday lenders here. It's a perfect technology to find people who are desperate for money and to take advantage of them. So I'm almost done. I want to take lots of questions because the best part is the questions. But I do have some ideas, and I need more ideas. Because these are big problems. I think these are some of the biggest problems that we're going to face. Because I think, number one, the effects of these algorithms are cumulative. People are going through these different stages of their life, and they're being tracked at every stage. And number two, it's only increasing. Let's face it. In 15 years, there's going to be a lot more of this, not less. So we got to learn how to make these algorithms be held accountable. So these are really just first efforts at that. So you need to help me think about strategy. How do you make this stuff accountable? Hippocratic oath for data scientists. One of the basic problems we have is that the data scientists like myself are never trained in ethics. I just happened to realize this stuff was messed up. Probably because I have my experience in finance, right? I realized that this could go wrong. The data scientists I worked with were like, what are you talking about? We're making money, everyone's happy. They were never trained to think what could go wrong. They're trained to think, I'm an engineer, I'm a technician, I'm just following the definition of success, I'm maximizing profit. We have to make our data scientists realize that when they build models that affect human lives, they have to think about what could go wrong. We need a lot more transparency. We need anything that touches the government and civil workers or criminals, prisoners. We have to know what they're actually doing. I think in the case of people like teachers, if your job is on the line, you should be able to inspect your score, like on an app. There should be an app for you to inspect your score. So what people often talk about transparency, I don't think it would be useful to give teachers the source code to their assessment algorithms. I do think it would be useful for them to have an app so that they could sort of do a sensitivity analysis on their scores, which is to say, like, what if one of my students had been sick that day? What would have happened to my score, et cetera. I'm always looking for evidence of harm. The hardest part about writing this book was that my editor was like, I want blood on every page. And it's really hard to find blood meaning people who have been screwed by algorithms. It's hard to do that when most algorithms are secret. How do people know they've been screwed? Those examples are coming to light, but we need to keep collecting them. I want to be able to build what's called a black box audit, where you figure out an algorithm isn't working by its input and output, not really understanding the source code directly. I'm waiting for some of that litigation to go through the courts, like the class action lawsuits, to say that you can't use a hiring algorithm that's illegal. Sounds pretty simple, right? But the enforcement isn't there. And the enforcement isn't there because the regulators essentially don't know how to deal with technology. And I believe in the European Commission has just fined Google $2.6 billion. And they're now looking for a team. I don't know if you guys heard about this. There's like a $10 million grant for a team to audit Google's algorithm. I love that idea, but $10 million is not enough. Google is a very large company, and their search algorithms are very, very complicated. That's going to be a very long-term project. For the outside world to say, is this algorithm unfair, fraudulent, antitrust violating? Is it ruining our democracy? How can we audit the Facebook political campaign ads? I don't know. But obviously there's antitrust challenges going on, update. And at the end of the day, I really don't think our laws, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think our laws are prepared for weapons of mass destruction. So we need to update those laws. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for a very stimulating talk. I'm sure that's going to lead to quite a number of questions. The gentleman in the front row here with the white shirt.
Hi, thanks, Cathy. That was great. I can think of companies that I've come across that seem to be using algorithms in a beneficial way, or maybe if I get good suggestions of books I might like on Amazon based on what I've bought before. Is there any sense in which you think kind of good drives out bad, at least commercially? Or indeed, in hiring, that is there a case whereby, a better algorithm, the firm that had the better algorithm, that didn't have the, let's follow what we did in the past algorithm, would end up with better employees and win in the end? Maybe it takes a while. But
it's a great question, and I wish it were true. Let me say it this way. There was a really good paper by Moritz Hart and others, and Moritz actually works at Google, recently about the cost of fairness. And so they took credit scoring algorithms, and they ignored what's called ECOA, Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And I'm sorry that this is so US based, this is how I understand it, but there's a law, I'm sure there's a similar one here, that says you can't discriminate based on gender or race when it comes to credit scores. But it's not clear exactly what that means, right? And so what they did was they optimized in 5 different ways. They optimized without any constraints, like forget fairness, and then they defined 4 different ways of being fair in terms of race. And they optimized to profit with those constraints, those 4 constraints. Sorry if this is too nerdy, but so one was optimizing to profit without constraints, and then 4 different types of constraints. And it was, they could do it 5 different ways. It costs money when you have a constraint, right? So it is less profitable. So fairness is expensive. Another way of saying that is in the free market of all credit scores, right? Of all companies that build credit scores and offer credit, the companies that ignore fairness the most will make more money. So they will outperform the other companies. So I think that's a general truth, that if you are maximizing to profit without constraint, you're going to be able to box out the other companies. So that's the argument I use for why we need a rule about this. We can't just allow people to bypass the concept of fairness because it's a race to the bottom rather than a race to fairness.
Hello. Do you think it's possible to counter these pernicious feedback loops algorithmically? Or is our best hope to evaluate algorithmic implementations of policy precisely in a way that's not algorithmic, using some other system, maybe an ethnographic system or something?
Okay, so let me back up. I am not against algorithms. I'm against messed up, unfair algorithms. I am for real scrutiny of how algorithms are used and real tests that they are being used fairly and legally. And we have those tests for human processes, right? We already have a rule that says you can't discriminate based on gender in hiring. But what we have now is this sort of magical avenue of bypassing that rule by using machine learning algorithms that for some reason everyone just blindly trusts. So what I'm asking for is, no, they're not magical. Let's not trust them blindly. Let's put them through the same tests and the same standards as any human process would be put through. So I'm actually asking for the standards to be raised to what we already have. Right now, we don't really have any standards for machine learning algorithms or for any algorithms. Like as soon as you say algorithm, people just roll their eyes glaze over, and that's because people are intimidated by math. We could talk about why people trust algorithms, but my point is, don't trust algorithms.
Hi. You spoke about transparency being a great way to try and fight these. Obviously, Western governments typically openly pro-transparency, but one of the areas that that's not the case is security services. I wonder to what extent, or if you know anything about it, are security services using weapons of mass destruction?
I am not an expert on security. And I should say there might be an exception in my transparency argument for security. So my general argument is the following. If you have a gameable algorithm that is very important to people and affects their lives crucially, then it should be transparent. So I believe, for example, that credit scores should be transparent. Because a gameable credit score is a shitty credit score. Let me give you an example. Somebody once suggested that instead of actually buying the data on whether you have been paying your electricity bill on time, you should just use as a proxy how many books do you have at your house to see whether you're creditworthy. Now, assuming that that would work as a proxy, right? More books means you're more creditworthy or whatever. The problem with that terrible proxy is that if you found out about that proxy, you get a higher credit score just by getting more books in your house, right? So that would be gaming. That would be gaming the credit score. But given that it's not used, that proxy isn't used, and instead we're asking for whether you've been paying your electricity bill on time, then gaming that credit score looks like paying your electricity bill on time. Do you see what I mean? So there is no way to game a good algorithm. Theoretically, a good teacher assessment score, a really good one, if you tried to game it, you'd be a better teacher. So I just want to make it clear that in some sense, transparency, if it's so bad for you that people will game it, that means it's not good enough. Get rid of it, right? Having said that, in the world of security, I don't think there is anything that can be reasonably described as a perfectly secure system. So in that one example, I think there's reason for secrecy. Which, but on the other hand, that's not the same, it's not the same realm, right? I'm talking about things that ruin people's lives as individuals. Secure systems are a little bit different. But again, I'm not an expert on security. Having said that, like if you're talking about security at an airport, that is much closer to what I've been talking about. And I wish I knew more about the security at airports, but the ACLU did a really good job of getting FOIA requests on how profiling happens at airports, and it looks a lot like a weapon of mass destruction, where they just simply have pseudoscientific justifications for racial profiling.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Sorry to ask another question on transparency, but I wanted to draw a parallel which just so happens to relate to security. I'm in cybersecurity, the encryption algorithms we use have been tested because they've been put out to the public. And that's how they've been tested to see if they are genuinely as secure as they can be. For algorithms that are used like this to score people in, say, where public goods are used, the law and so on, and the teacher example, would it not be possible for those algorithms to be put out for people to test whether they're legal, whether they meet those standards before they're used?
I think I understand what you're asking. I'll say something and then you can nod if I've addressed your question. I don't think we need to have open source code. I think if we do it right, we can develop ways of understanding whether things are working that, number one, doesn't reveal the source code, and number two, doesn't reveal the personal identifying data on the individuals that are being targeted by the algorithm. But what it does do is it sort of it pokes at the algorithm to make sure it's acting in a reasonable way, transparently. But the transparent part is the audit. So it's like the transparent audit without, it's a little bit like if you have an emissions test on a car, let's say. We don't see how the car works. We don't understand the transmission, but we do see the results of the emissions test.
Quite a lot of questions. Let's take two at a time to start with. Okay, over here.
It was another one on transparency, but I wondered, I guess, once you have transparency, you can maybe change your behavior going forward or do something different, but a lot of this data is already out there, and you can't go back and change that or choose to share less or have acted any differently, and I'm not sure how you can get around that.
One more question.
Thank you. I was slightly surprised that you said that you weren't against all algorithms, because in a sense your preparing dinner one shows exactly what the problem is, that it is an oversimplification and is inevitably an oversimplification. And at least in that case, you do know, you don't just have a guess, what the right outcome is, that your children are satisfied. We don't know what makes a good teacher well enough to design a good algorithm. We don't know what makes a repeat offender well enough. So isn't the problem not the algorithm, but the objective? We were finding bad ways of identifying good teachers long before we had algorithms.
It's a very deep comment. And I want to be clear that I think any teacher assessment algorithm that would be built, if it were adequately monitored and audited, would be found to be so crappy that we'd throw it away. I don't think we're ready to have algorithms that assess teachers, because we don't have an agreement on what a good teacher is. I would go further, and I would say that many of the algorithms are not randomly chosen where they pop up. Where they pop up is a political mess. Algorithms are the silver bullet that people drag in because they don't want to have a difficult conversation. They don't want to have the conversation about what a good teacher really is. So they bypass that difficult conversation by saying, let's just bring in this algorithm, and then number one, we won't have to have this conversation, and number two, we can all point at the algorithm when it messes up, and it's not our responsibility. So in that sense, it's a perfect bureaucratic mechanism to avoid responsibility, but that doesn't mean it's working. So what I'm claiming, I'm kind of like, it's inevitable. If you talk to people in government, they're so excited about algorithms that they're going to put those algorithms in. And I'm saying we need monitors on those algorithms to make sure they're working, because I don't think they're going to work. And we need the evidence that they're not working. We need to put science into data science, and we need to establish the evidence of whether they're working or not. And in the teacher case, it's not going to be, we're not going to have the evidence, because it's not going to work. I also don't think it's going to work in the criminal justice system, because the data is just not good. However, I do think there is a place for algorithms if we get to the point where we know how to monitor them for safety and for legality and for fairness. So I'm not anti-algorithm, although some people are, and I respect that. Some people will say, we're just not ready for that. I feel like we're going to have it. And I want to be as practical as possible, saying if we're going to have it, here are the safety mechanisms that we need to attach to them so we can keep track of just how bad they are. As for, yes, you can't erase your data. I am also kind of a pragmatist in terms of data and privacy, which is to say I don't think we have control over our private data. So I am much more interested in thinking about the regulation around how data can be used against us rather than what data is out there. It's a very simple way of saying that.
Hi. You've talked about the dangers around relying on a limited number of data sources to determine a decision-making process. But given the complexity around such a simple question as what makes a good teacher, in order to answer that, at some point, we have to choose some data sources, and they're bound to be subjective. So in that case, do you think it's better that rather than rely on one algorithm, we rely on two that almost red teams the other? And therefore, we have two measures that we can use to try and determine a potential outcome. Because it feels like if we don't, we're never going to get a perfect answer, because what makes a good teacher to me doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to everyone else in this room. And I just wonder, you've highlighted the dangers around our algorithms, but I feel like at the end of the day, we do have to whittle the data we've got down to a limited number of sources, and therefore use that data to try and get some outcome, even if it's not perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, another question? Right in the back.
Yeah, let's get her.
Thank you very much. I have 2 questions. I'll try and keep them short. So the first question is whether you are interested in looking at variation across countries, or perhaps within the America variation between states in terms of the way in which this is being handled by public authorities. And then my second question is, I did some research about big data in South Africa and trying to see what the state was doing with data. And perhaps the only place that the South African state was using data was in taxation, in trying to find taxpayers. And that's a case where you kind of don't want transparency because you want the people to pay their taxes. So I'm wondering if you know anything about algorithms in the tax system in the US or other advanced economies. Thank you.
Okay. I'll start with your question. I think your question has as its premise something I disagree with, which is that we must have a way of assessing teachers that is used widely. I think the truth is we will never have that. I think what we have instead, even though this is frustrating to people, is totally different ways of teaching, totally different ways of learning, depending on the culture, depending on the kids, depending on the cultural context. And the thing about algorithms at scale is that they pretend, they make the simplifying assumption that everything is comparable. And I just don't think that happens to be true. Having said that, I obviously think that having more than one thing is better than having only one thing, especially if the one thing is just somehow described as like declared to be true. So one of the things about the value-added model that drives me nuts is 2 different value-added models have completely different scores for a given teacher in a given year for a different same classroom. If those both had been, if both of those scores had been given to a teacher, it would have been obvious to teachers that these are not consistent, right? So it would have exposed how bad they are faster. I'm afraid that that's the best we can do right now with teacher assessments. We don't have a definition of a good teacher. And that's not going to be improved by just saying big data works, right? It's just a fact. I wish I had more time to do my research across countries. I'm very interested in microfinance algorithms, especially credit scoring algorithms in India. I keep on getting emails from people in India saying, I know you say you shouldn't use race in credit score algorithms as an attribute, but can I use caste? And I'm like, no, you can't. Having said that, like, you can, but how are you gonna apply that algorithm? It's very important to me that you guys don't leave with me thinking that like algorithms are inherently evil. I actually think the recidivism risk algorithms are very, very interesting. Very interesting. They expose problems in our culture about how people who are poor, people who are of color, have way more obstacles to getting their lives back together than other people. And if we examine that, as a sociologist might, like, what are the interventions that we can perform to actually decrease that gap? That would be very, very fascinating. So we could use that as an academic tool, right, to lead us into inquiry. But instead what we're doing is we're saying, this is a consequence of huge societal problems, but instead of interrogating those problems, we're going to shift the blame to the individual and sentence them to longer in prison. I mean, that's not okay. So it's the usage of the algorithm rather than the algorithm itself. And finally, with respect to taxes, I don't really have a lot to say, but I do want to say that in the States that the tax system is very intentionally overcomplicated so that people will be reliant on tax preparation algorithms. So there's an industry keeping the tax code complicated. And and intimidating the shit out of people so that they can't do their taxes by themselves. So it goes back to the question of why do we trust algorithms so much? Because we're afraid and intimidated by mathematics. That's a problem.
Upstairs, over here.
Hi. So bias was obviously prevalent prior to algorithms existing, but they're sort of being blamed for this, for encouraging bias in certain situations. Now, if there was a company that was found to have biased employment rules, for example, that they had racial discrimination, they would be held accountable and punished in some way. How do you feel about personal accountability for people who construct and build these algorithms to being held accountable to the effects of these algorithms, so to speak, on a personal basis?
Another question?
Hi, thank you. What's your favorite example or favorite few examples of an algorithm that has been built and used in a way that feels really good?
Oh, I got one. My favorite algorithm is Google Navigation. It is unbelievable. It's so cool. I mean, I went to Ireland last week with my son, and I'm here now, and I can go anywhere. It's freedom. And not to mention that when, on a holiday weekend, when I'm driving back home from upstate New York, like it routes me in these unbelievable weird ways and saves hours and hours on the highway. Having, bad for, global warming and everything that I'm driving in the first place, but I love that algorithm. I think it's unbelievable. Now, having said that, there's always different stakeholders. I learned something called the ethical matrix, which I think is really useful to sort of understand algorithms. Okay, so here's what it is. It's a two-dimensional box. It's a matrix, right? On the rows, you talk about the stakeholders of an algorithm. So in the case of recidivism risk algorithms, it's like the judge, the court system, maybe the police, the defendants, the public. They're the stakeholders. They care about the outputs, right? Public safety, whatever, justice, civil rights on the behalf of the defendant. And then on the rows, you think about like the different things they would care about. Is it fairness, transparency, things like that. So if you did that, and by the way, you want to analyze an algorithm, build the ethical matrix, and think about who cares about what and how much harm will come to them if things go wrong and stuff like that, and how often things go wrong. But in the case of the Google Maps, Google Navigation, the people that are harmed the most are people whose houses used to be on quiet streets, but now Google keeps routing people in front of their house and they're really annoyed. And I'm just like, you don't own the street in front of your house. It's like one case where I'm just like, whatever. Like, I think more good comes from these algorithms than harm. And by the way, and this happened in London a lot too. I've heard about this in London, but basically the response is that people make everything one way, the wrong way, so that never happens again. So there's this sort of ongoing feedback loop with respect to Google Navigation. That's probably way more than you want to know. Okay, so personal accountability, somebody asked me about. So I wanted to mention that Ben Schneiderman from the University of Maryland came to London last month and spoke at the Alan Turing Institute in a public lecture. And he suggested that we have what's called a national, really international, algorithmic safety board, along the lines of the National Transportation Safety Board. And that Transportation Safety Board has a long and very interesting history of basically investigating disasters around transportation, mostly airplane crashes. Like, what went wrong? How do we avoid this in the future? What kind of safety things can we put onto the airplane design to make them safer? Or air traffic control, or whatever. Very, very thoughtful guy. One of the critical things that he's calling for is personal accountability. He said the National Transportation Board and the National Algorithmic Safety Board should absolutely decide not only what went wrong with an algorithmic disaster, but who was responsible. That is something that I think would be a huge step forward in the concept of accountability for algorithms. We don't have personal responsibility whatsoever. Even though it's made by humans, you'd think that along the way, some human would be responsible for a mistake of an algorithm. The way it's actually devised Nobody ever is. Let me give you a story. I was talking to someone who built a recidivism risk algorithm for a state prison system. And I talked to him about it. I said, do you ever use race as an attribute? And he said, oh, no, I'd never do that. And they said, well, do you ever use zip code? Which is a proxy for race, yeah. And he was like, sometimes, because it just makes it so much more accurate. So I'm thinking to myself, accuracy but not fairness. That's what that guy is optimizing on. It's his definition of success. Everyone has a definition of success. It's useful if you figure it out. And then I said, well, is there anyone at the state, in the state prison system, who asks you what you use or tells you what is ethically allowable? And he said, oh no, they just trust me because I have a PhD. And I said, well, in that case, do you ever feel personally ethically responsible for your algorithms? And he said, oh no, I just build the algorithm, they use it. I was like, oh, okay. So no one's responsible. That I think it would be a really step forward if we could change that and actually name a name. Having said that, we've tried that in business and it hasn't worked. So I think we should do it. I don't know if we will.
This side here, third row back.
Thank you for your great work on algorithms. Can we hope that you will now write a book on your work in response to the global financial crisis, including with the alternative banking group, the like of which seems to have died in the UK?
Okay, this side here.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to know how you think we can sort of solve the issue of biases such as in gender and race when there's always going to be proxies and sort of algorithmic synonyms for them. How can you actually stamp it out with legislation?
So, just to be clear, I think that, first of all, there are proxies for race. Is that what you're talking about? Synonyms? Yeah, proxies for race. They're not that hard to infer. Like, you can infer how much a given attribute is correlated to race. And you can decorrelate attributes from race. There's something called principal component analysis that allows you to do that. So we can do this. We're choosing not to do this. And it's because there's no threat. There's no threat in enforcement. There's no fine. If there were a fine, it's probably a fraction of the profit being made on using the stuff. So we've got some work ahead of us, but it's not impossible. All banking is doing great. It's my Occupy group. We meet every Sunday. They met yesterday without me for the second week in a row because I've been away. But to be honest, we don't talk that much about banking anymore. We talk about social justice, and in the age of Trump, that's a lot. We talk about it through the lens of finance, which is a really interesting way of thinking about it. Follow the money is always the right question to ask when you talk about social justice. And it's a really interesting conversation. I welcome you all on Sunday afternoons at Columbia University. If you're in New York City, please come by.
And is there another book in it?
We actually wrote a book already. It's called Occupy Finance, and it's available online.
Okay, last couple of questions, I think. Way over here, second row.
Thank you.
Right at the front here.
Thank you, I really enjoyed the talk. One of the things I sort of picked up on was many of the examples were from the sort of public sector, education, prisons, and in many cases it was examples where the law has been obscured based on, discriminating based on mental health or race and things like that. I wondered if we were to sort of imagine an ideal world where the law is not being obscured and we're referring to sort of ideal cases, on whom would you say the onus lies for this responsibility of creating fair algorithms, in the sense that in the public sector it may lay on the government, but in cases, for example, in Amazon or Facebook where they're recommending you things or putting things on your newsfeed, would you say that that's up to them and they can fail on their own incompetence?
Thank you. You spoke about the bias in data which we are using actually in order to feed the algorithms which we are doing, and how that one leads to increased social injustice which already existed in the data that we're using. So one of the best examples for me is the education system in the US, where you need to find student loans and then you go to private loans in the end because your parents don't have money, which ends up to be very high rates of student debt, which leads later on to much, well, not a very good situation, let's put it that way. How would you, because we are looking in the company that I'm working for, how to actually factor for that one and actually creating a more just situation, how would you factor for data that doesn't exist, because essentially it's all bias today?
Okay, I'm going to answer your question first. As much as I care about algorithms, not everything is an algorithm. The student loan crisis in the United States is simply because colleges are too expensive. So what we need to do is we need to rebuild the affordable state college system. And then other colleges will have to compete on price. That just hasn't been true for 20 years. Part of the reason it hasn't been true for 20 years is because this ranking system for colleges, the US News and World Report ranking system, has been running wild and is actually blind to cost. So the US News and World Report judges a college based on factors that have nothing to do with cost, which means that when college administrators game the algorithm to increase their rank, to make their college look fancier, they are allowed to use as much money as they want to do so, which means that tuitions go up. So it's just a mess. And state colleges have been defunded and they've been raising their prices. So student loans, to solve that crisis, you don't use an algorithm. You just put more money into investing for the next generation. In terms of the Facebook, I'm afraid that I don't think the algorithm at Facebook is going to fail by its own, on its own. I think it's a very, very successful propaganda machine that's making just tons of money. And so is Google. Google made more money in ads than every magazine, newspaper, and radio show combined in the last quarter, just sucking up all the ad buys in the world. There's no reason to think it's going to fail, and Facebook either. Facebook sucks up all the political dark money. Where does that go? It goes to Facebook, increasingly. It's about half Facebook, half television. And as television becomes more tailored, which it's on its way of doing, then watching television becomes much more like being on Facebook. So I don't think there's any reason to think we're going to see a failure of that. I think the question is whether our laws to protect democracy are up to the task. And I don't know the answer to that.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Cathy
you.
O'Neill.
Thanks, guys.